Hi students, welcome to the final review session for Geography 3340, Political Geography. This is a live Zoom session. We're doing an online review, but this is the video recording for those of you who were not able to make it. Okay, so let me just go ahead and start with an opportunity for the students who are participating to ask some questions. Does anybody have any house questions? I will talk about the overview of the exam, but I want to give you an opportunity to ask some questions.
When do you think the paper will be graded?
Okay, so the paper, it will take another probably, by not this Friday, but the following Friday is when we're aiming to have those back to you. And the way that you're going to get, so that would be Friday the 15th. Well, we're going to attempt to have them done by the 13th, which is the exam date. And the way that you will know that your paper has been graded is that you will receive an email that will have the rubric that's available online with your score and just a brief note about the essay. So you'll get those, unfortunately, not in time to impact your preparation for the final, but that's when we can have them back. Usually I have the papers come in a little bit earlier so that they can be graded by today, but with the COVID and everything, I wanted to give the students more time, you students more time to write.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Do we have any other questions? No? Okay.
No.
All right. Well, has everyone found the review?
Yes.
Where did you find it?
It's
On
week 15 in the resources, right?
Yep, under resources, week 15 course review for this week. Yeah, and we have a 2-pager. We've crammed all of the questions and the terms here. Thank you to all of you who participated on forums to help prepare for today. Let me just talk a little bit about the overview of the final exam structure. You will have the entire day on the 13th, just, well, not as you've done before. I'm getting my courses confused, pardon. You're going to have an online final exam, and you're going to be able to take the final exam anytime on the 13th. And once you begin the exam, you'll have 2 hours and a half to complete the exam. The exam is going to be the same structure that you had for the midterm, but I think you'll find it a little bit easier because you have a whole other hour and it's the same length, and you're able to type your answers rather than write them out by hand, which I know is not a whole lot of fun. So you've got experience under your belt and perhaps a little bit more user-friendly format for you. You're going to have the same set of IDs. You'll be given 4 IDs. You'll answer 3. You'll have 3 short answer options. You'll answer 2, and then 2 options for the short essay, and you'll answer 1 of those. Okay, so it's the exact same exam. Now, the question that's really important is the exam comprehensive? Does anybody remember what I've said about whether or not this exam is comprehensive, meaning it covers the entire course or it just covers the second half?
I believe you said it was the second half.
It's just the second half, that's right. Now, you're welcome to draw on material from the first part of the course if you would like to. And so, for example, if you were answering a question about survival migration, and you wanted to talk about the discourse of migration versus refugee. Remember, a discourse are all the things that are associated with the images and language associated with a phenomenon. And so it might make sense for you to talk about why the discourse of migrant is so poor when we think about how it creates this binary between a migrant and a refugee, right? And all of the other binaries that are associated with it. So I'm not going to be asking you empirical information from the first half, for example, about Jim Crow or about Linnaeus or the creation of the third world. You won't have any of that material, but you're welcome to draw on any theoretical or conceptual tools from the first half. Okay, does that make sense?
Yes.
All right. Great. Any other questions before we dig into the material?
On the short essay questions that are on the last page, there are 2 of them that are underlined. Am I to think that those might be the ones on the exam?
No, I just copied and pasted those rather than typing them from the forums. And so
Okay.
it was a hyperlink. And if I couldn't remove the hyperlink and just left it as is. So that is not a clue. But I will give you some clues because I've started working on the exam, and I think I have a good idea at least of what the short essay questions will be like, and we'll talk about that in the next hour. Yeah, so that's not a clue, unfortunately.
Is it possible for us to see our first exam?
You can meet with me and I will go over the exam with you. There's no written feedback. There's just a score on the exams. So email me about that and I will meet with you in person.
Awesome, thank you.
And usually that entails me sort of working through your answers with you and describing what you did really well and how you might have improved your response.
How the exam is weighted?
The exam, gosh, that is a really good question. If I go back to the syllabus, I think this exam is weighted a little bit more heavily. Is that right?
I think it's 30%.
30%, yeah, let me just confirm that. I should have that information at the top of my head, but I want to look at the syllabus just to make sure. Okay, so the midterm is worth 20% and the final exam is worth 30%. So it's definitely worth more. And the racial segregation analysis is also worth 30%. And just to sort of put your mind at ease, I've had conversations with a couple of students, and I understand that given the online transition and all of the upheaval in your lives from this moment, that many of you feel you weren't able to produce a paper that you would have liked to produce, and so we'll be taking that into account when we grade the papers. And I'm also taking the approach of being very generous and having a high average for this final exam.
Good.
And when should we expect
Very
the
appreciated.
grades for our attendance and participation?
For attendance and participation, I'll get those to you by the end of this week.
And what about for the racial segregation analysis? Do you know when?
Yes, so we aim to have those done by next Wednesday. And so those, unfortunately, we're still working through those, but we'll get those to you as soon as we can. It probably won't be in time for you to know how hard you have to study for the final. So please just, you're here, you're studying. Sorry I can't get those back to you a little bit earlier. Ross, I think you jumped on a few minutes after I explained this, but normally I have these as they were originally due mid-April, but I pushed that back because of COVID. So the implication has been that you're not getting them back before the final.
When are final grades due?
They're due Monday after our exam. So that's the 18th. They're due May 18th.
18, okay.
And it's, it's quite, as you know, our final comes a little bit late in the schedule, and it's a pretty fast turnaround. But are you guys still there? I lost you. There we are. It's a pretty fast turnaround, but we're doing the best we can.
Okay.
Plus, like, how many points each of the ID terms is worth and how many points each of the short answer and the essay?
It's the same as it was for the midterm, where the IDs are worth 3 points each for a total of 9. The short answer is a total of 20 points, and then the short essay is 21. 9, yeah. For a total of 50. Okay. So if you have your worksheets, let's go ahead and just take a few minutes. I want to give maybe 3 or 4 minutes for people to look really carefully at the list of terms. Okay. Or actually, folks, you know what I think might be more interesting is if we start with the short answer questions and the short essay questions rather than terms. How does that sound?
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, that's
Someone just
good.
reminded us that 21 or that 41 out of 50 points are based on essays rather than IDs. Let's maybe talk about essays and work on that format. Because you just got this, I want you to take a few minutes to think to yourself and read these questions, okay? And if you have extra time, you can go back to the front to look at the terms. The idea here is that I want you to identify questions that you need help with, questions that you wouldn't be able to answer as fully as you would like to. All right, so I'm going to give you a few minutes to do that.
When we're typing our essay, how do we know we've reached like 2 or 3 pages?
That's a really good question. So normally I would think about, a decent sized paragraph, a normal paragraph with 5 or 6 sentences. Probably like 6 or 7 paragraphs, I would say, for the short essay, and sort of 3 paragraphs, 2 to 3 paragraphs, 2 long paragraphs for the short answer. But if I were you, I would really take advantage of the fact that you're able to type and that you have the time to answer as fully as possible.
Okay.
As relevant. If I'm asking you a question about survival migration, don't start talking about everything under the sun you remember from the class, right? But you're going to have a little bit of time, and I think a little bit more ease typing.
Okay.
But that's a good question. How would you know the length?
Because we're gonna do it on tracks, correct?
Yeah, it's going to be on tracks. And maybe you've given me an idea, actually, rather than talking about pages, maybe I'll talk in terms of paragraphs and that way it can be a little bit more clear. That's a good idea. So that when I ask, for the short answer question, what does the term granito mean in the documentary by the same title? In 2 to 3 paragraphs. And then for the short essay, I'll say something like, 6 to 8 paragraphs or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, folks, let's go ahead and dig into these questions. You've had a few minutes to look at them. Where do we want to start? If you remember, sort of the way we did this before was that one of you would start with a question and we brainstorm a collective response.
So can we start with granito, since you already mentioned it?
Yeah, and who, well, it's important that you watch the film. So if you haven't done that, you have a little bit of time to do that. What does the term granito mean in the documentary by the same title? And when do you remember that in the film?
Isn't it about, it's something to do with a grain and how one doesn't make a difference, but collectively it does?
Yes, very good. So granito in Spanish means a small grain, right? And the metaphor was a grain of sand. And who was the speaker, the social activist and Nobel Peace Prize winner who was explaining that theory of social change in the film? Who remembers her name?
Rigoberta Menchú.
Rigoberta Menchú. Yes, Rigoberta Menchú. She is the Nobel Prize laureate winner in 1992 for the Peace Prize for bringing to international attention the genocide that was taking place in Guatemala. And she has a theory of social change and political transformation that she talks about through the metaphor of granito. And it's the idea that social change, like changing a unequal and racist political and economic system in Guatemala, that one person can't do that work by themselves. Each person, she says, has their own granito de arena, their own grain of sand to contribute to social transformation. And so it's a theory of collective change, that each person has their own role to sort of lead where they land, to advocate for a more just and inclusive world. And for Pamela Yates, who's Pamela Yates?
Isn't she the documentarian?
Yes, she's the documentarian, and she's one of the protagonists in the film Granito, How to Nail a Dictator. And she talks about her own role as a filmmaker as being her granito de arena, right? I kind of like, thinking that we don't have to do everything. We just need to do what we can do from our position. Yeah. Great. Next question. Oh, folks, I do see a mistake here. Halfway through the short essay questions, I'll erase this and put a new version up. We did not read the Thomas Barnett article, so that question about Thomas Barnett is not relevant. So don't be worried about Thomas Barnett. We didn't read him.
What are the 3 Malthusian legacies?
Okay, let's talk. And remember, folks, we need to be able to do several things when we talk about Malthus. One, you've got to be able to talk about the political context of Malthus's day that motivated him writing the Principle of Population. And you have to be able to talk about the legacies of Malthus, okay? So let's go ahead and work through the question. I think that was Parker that posed that question, talking about Malthus's legacies. All right, we've talked about Malthus's legacies kind of in the short term and then the longer term. So what were some of the Malthusian legacies that you remember us talking and reading about?
Population.
So one of the Malthusian legacies is the population bomb, and
Right.
the concept that, especially as like in the 1960s, it became really, really relevant in popular culture that, you know, it was going to be all these people in the poor world having tons of children that were going to like sink the ship and we were going to run out of food.
Yeah, and that New York Times video is so great at capturing that moment from today, right? And sort of really communicating how much, how powerful the population bomb was. When was the population bomb published? You probably don't remember off the top of your head, but it is the 1960s. It's 1968, right? A whole 170 years after Malthus writes the Principle of Population. Now, tell me, what is Malthus's Principle of Population? What is his natural law that he writes about in that paper?
That food production grows arithmetically, i.e. like 2 + 2 + 2. Population is exponential, you know, 2 × 2 × 2. So
Right.
that population will outstrip food supply.
So population is always going to outstrip food supply, and this will lead to famine, starvation, misery, and vice, right? And he argued that the poor people were unable to control their reproduction. And it was a very sort of derogatory perspective on the lower classes in England, that this was a problem of the lower classes, not of the aristocracy like himself. Right. So he argues that food production will always be outstripped by population growth. Yes, that population grows geometrically 2 × 2, food production arithmetically. I guess if you put it in a formula, it sounds scientific, right? You add some math. And yeah, so that was his Principle of Population. So how is Ehrlich similar and also different from Malthus? How does his argument build on Malthus, but also change it a little bit? This is an important question.
Did Ehrlich, is he the one who wrote the population bomb?
Yeah, Paul Ehrlich writes the population bomb in 1968, right? But this time he's not concerned about famine per se. What is he arguing overpopulation is causing?
Poverty.
Yes, but something else in particular.
Environmental problems.
Environmental problems. Yes, exactly. He's talking about, he uses Malthus. He still argues that overpopulation is the problem, but rather than saying that overpopulation causes famine, like Malthus does, he says overpopulation creates environmental degradation, that overpopulation is to blame for environmental degradation. Does that sound familiar? Most of us have heard this idea, this discourse. Overpopulation is a really powerful discourse, right? I've got Foucault here, who says that knowledge is power. And Foucault would say that, you know, the power to define the problem also impacts the solution. So if overpopulation is the problem that causes environmental degradation, well, then the solution is to control people's fertility, right? But just like any discourse, when you argue this is the problem and not that, you're sort of not paying attention to other potential drivers of environmental degradation. And we were making a strong case in our lecture that actually the distribution of resources and overconsumption is a large driver of environmental degradation. Do you remember when we went through some of that empirical evidence, and we noted that 70% of the world's natural resources are consumed by 20% of people, right? So when you're sort of walking through, you're comparing and contrasting the principle of population with the population bomb, which is about overpopulation creates environmental degradation. We want to be thinking about, critiquing Ehrlich and his argument that overpopulation creates environmental problems, because what that discourse does is it blames largely third world countries with high population rates for environmental degradation, when in fact it has been the process of industrialization and developed wealthy countries that have contributed the most carbon to the atmosphere and disproportionately used other environmental resources. Does that make sense?
That does. Not all that palm oil is used in Borneo.
Precisely. What do you mean by that? Explain people who aren't aware of what's going on with palm oil and Southeast Asia.
So, that's one of the major causes of deforestation in the Indonesian archipelago is burning rainforests to create room for palm oil plantations.
Yeah, new plantations.
Yeah, and that's largely driven by global demand for palm oil, which is in thousands, if not millions, of different products. It turns out it's like one of the most useful and versatile oils that there is, and it's also got a high yield, but it's terrible for the environment and orangutans for destroying native forests. So like that, but that's the quickest route out of poverty. Like in Borneo, it's, if you can get yourself set up a palm oil plantation, it's like sort of like setting up, growing grapes or olives in Greece. It's like you have a perpetual source of income after that.
Right, but when you think about sort of the poverty alleviation strategy of palm oil plantations, it is global economic development on the traditional route. How, who owns that palm oil plantation and the wages? I know this because palm oil is planted around Latin America, Central America, and the Amazon. It's also a driver of deforestation in the Amazon. It's plantation-based development. You've got one wealthy landowner who is making a killing, but the people who are working in those labor contexts are not doing well. And many of them actually bear the negative environmental consequences, either being exposed to pesticides themselves, or you have sort of the leaching into the water sources. Palm oil has been associated with ecocide in Guatemala. It's very controversial. Yeah, okay, so the idea here is that overpopulation may not be the principal driver of environmental degradation, right? But really powerfully, just like Malthus, what Ehrlich is doing is blaming the poor for problems that wealthy components of society helped produce, right? So I am going to ask you to, most definitely on this exam, you're going to have the question, what role did the politics of Malthus's day play in shaping his argument? So you've got to be able to walk through the history of the enclosures and the Pitt and Whitebread debate. So who wants to get us started reviewing that narrative?
If I recall, so the Pitt was against the expansion of the poor laws because he viewed it as he didn't want to restrict the flow of labor to the cities, and he felt like the poor laws or like any sort of expansion of them would have kept more labor on farms or raised the price of labor, whereas Whitbread saw a need for more social provision.
Okay, you've almost got it right there. But Pitt and Whitbread were not debating at first the poor laws. The poor laws is the result of that debate. They're debating the Act of Settlement of 1662, I think. 1662, this is feudal England. The Act of Settlement is a feudal law that settles or ties commoners, peasants to a feudal estate, where the aristocrat, the owner of that estate, the feudal lord, had somewhat of an obligation alongside the church to provide basic social safety net to the people that were living on the feudal estate. It was a system of labor immobility is what you're getting at, Ross, and you're exactly right. But it was the Act of Settlement. It was a law of immobility. There was not a free system of labor. But what happens after the Act of Settlement with the enclosures? Tell me about the enclosures, because I want you to start your essay on Malthus's politics of his day, talking about the enclosures. So the enclosures happen from the late 1600s, you can say from throughout the 1700s, right? What are the enclosures?
Wasn't this a time when, so the peasants during the time they would rent out their land, so to say, from tenants? It was kind of like a sharecropper process, but they were open to the free land to go get wood and fresh water and supplies. But the enclosures basically made that land privately owned, so the peasants no longer had access to that land.
Yeah, exactly. And so, yes, it's interesting. Does anybody know what the term usufruct rights means? Usufruct rights?
How is that spelled? Is that German?
Usufruct, oh, you can't see it, it's backward. Basically, usufruct rights are when you don't own the land, but you have the right to the resources on the land. In fact, this is the way that Native Americans think about property in general. There's no such thing as the privatization of property. The concept doesn't exist. But in Native Indigenous communities, there are often sort of usufruct rights, which means that someone has access to those resources. So what we're describing here is that prior to the Industrial Revolution, which happens in England, it starts sort of mid-1700s, early 1700s, alongside the birth of capitalism, there is the widespread privatization of property. And this was a revolution in the history of man, the privatization of property. And what this meant was that this new privatization of property, yes, it replaced that old land use system and land ownership system under feudalism. And I don't know who it was, but you're right on point. I think it might have been Allison, that during feudal times, the peasants, who were also called the commoners, yes, they worked on the feudal estate. They were largely producing agriculture, animal, sort of farm-based production. And they did give a share of what they produced to the feudal estate. That's why it's similar to sharecropping. And also the commoners, the peasants, they were called the commoners, they had access to the commons. And the commons were those areas of land between these large estates where they could go and have access to natural resources like wood for building their homes or for fuel. They could hunt for meat, for a source of food. They also had access to grazing lands for their animals. And so what happens during the 1700s with the enclosures is that all of the common lands that belonged to the commoners, that were used by the commoners, they were privatized. And so the commoners lost access to all of those resources, right? And of course, yeah, this is pre-capitalism. That's not a capitalist economic system. The transition to capitalism was based on the enclosures. And this is what Marx calls primitive accumulation, the first accumulation in the system of capitalism, the privatization of the commons. And he says this is really important because if the commoners don't have access to the commons, they now have to earn a wage to buy the things on the capitalist market that they used to produce for themselves. So when you take people's land, it forces them into capitalist production. We saw this with Rigoberta Menchú talking about how her family didn't have enough land to produce enough food, so they had to go and work in the southern plantations for a couple months out of the year. If you remember, 2 of her brothers died working on a cotton plantation. So it's really critical for you to understand that the principle of population is a reflection of the politics of the enclosures and privatization of the commoners' lands, and also the transition to capitalism more broadly, right? So as capitalism is replacing feudalism as the main economic system of production, you have commoners who are now moving to cities to work in wage labor rather than in the old system, what Marx would call the old mode of production under feudalism. And this creates a lot of hardship. Tell me what life is like in London and Manchester and Newcastle and Portsmouth. What is life like in these quickly growing industrial cities?
Pretty grim. There was basically like no labor protections. Children were working in factories, especially because their hands were small enough to reach between the gears. And there was no minimum wage. There was no safety net. There was basically like nothing to protect them. There's actually like a really interesting HBO show that takes place during this time, where they kind of show like the horrors of the coal mines.
And what is that show called?
Oh gosh, it's about a lesbian, a famous lesbian who was like a landowner at that time. But it's an amazing show, and I will get you the title. I was just thinking about it.
But you've got to sort of really understand this story. You have to understand how difficult life was in the city. Yes, there was widespread homelessness, people living in slums. There was no waste management, right? There was no sewer systems. Coal was the primary source of heat energy. So there was a lot of respiratory problems. The city was dirty. And it was just a really hard place to be. And so what's happening in Parliament at this time, in the late 1700s, we're at the tail end of the enclosures. We're at the sort of in the moment of the Industrial Revolution, the birth of capitalism. And Parliament is wondering, well, first of all, we have to revise the Act of Settlement because people are not tied to feudal estates anymore. We need people to move to the cities to be the labor force for the Industrial Revolution. But then also, if you're repealing the Act of Settlement, who's guaranteeing basic life for these people if it's not going to be the feudal lord, right? And so that's what Pitt and Whitbread are debating. This repeal of the Act of Settlement, which is really about the new labor system and welfare system that's going to take the place of feudalism under capitalism. It's a big moment. This is the first debate about welfare under capitalism that we know of, right? So tell me a little bit more about Pitt and Whitbread. What were their two takes on this moment and the repeal of the Act of Settlement? I know others of you know this story. All right, Pitt and Whitbread. Remember which one was pro-poor, which one was against helping the poor?
Pitt was against helping the poor, and then Whitbread was wanting to give the people bread. That's how I remember it.
Remember that Whitbread was advocating to give people bread. Yes, most definitely. And so Whitbread was basically arguing for some sort of, you know, the equivalent of food stamps for people who do not make enough money or are unemployed to provide them food relief, right? And that was Whitbread. Pitt was against it, right? And who ultimately wins the debate? Pitt or Whitbread?
Whitbread.
Whitbread, yes. And we have passed the Poor Laws, or the Spinamlen. You have, I think Spinamlen is here, the Poor Laws, 1796 Spinaman Laws, also called the Poor Laws. Okay, so the Poor Laws are passed in 1796, basically supplementing wages to a living wage, or not what we consider a living wage today, but basically giving food relief to the poor. Tell me why the folks in Parliament were motivated to pass the Poor Laws in 1796. It wasn't just out of the goodness of their own heart.
They didn't want another French Revolution.
Yes, that was definitely part of the equation. That France was in turmoil, the French Revolution, the monarchy had been overthrown, the aristocracy had been overthrown in France violently. We have the birth of democracy occurring on the other side of the channel. And not only are the elites in England learning from what the aristocracy didn't learn in France, this is also contributing to increasing food costs, because a lot of wheat was imported from France, and so the UK was cut off from continental Europe in terms of imports. So yes, it's important that you remember that the rich were also concerned with keeping their heads, literally, during this moment. So the Poor Laws are passed. What does Malthus think about this?
He thinks that they're just going to incentivize the poor to continue breeding past their supportable numbers, etc. Lots of other paternalistic ideas. Oh, and by the way, the name of that series, I found it's Gentleman Jack. And it's about Ann Lister, who was an aristocrat. If you haven't binge watched it yet, I'm sure you binge watched everything else. Go ahead, hit that one. It's great. You might
even be able to put it under the category of studying, at least for a little while. So, okay, yes, Malthus, and you can imagine, right? Like, you're in the city, Malthus is in his fancy carriage going from his home in London to his estate, and he's just seeing the filth, and it looks crowded. It's kind of very similar to, you know, Paul Ehrlich traveling to India and being horrified at the poor masses, the crowded masses of poor people living at the time. And so, yeah, Malthus doesn't support this idea. And why were many members of the aristocracy against the Poor Laws? How were the Poor Laws being paid for, right? The Poor Laws were financed through taxation of the wealthy. And so, you know, Malthus is also sort of looking at the taxation and the cost of this program, and he writes the Poor Laws, or excuse me, the Principle of Population in 1798 as a consequence. Okay. All right. So back to, I can't remember who, I think it was Parker maybe, who originally asked the question of Malthus's legacy. So here are the short-term legacies of Malthus. Well, the Poor Laws are repealed, right? The Poor Laws of 1796 are repealed, and in 1834, new Poor Laws are put into place, which was the criminalization of poverty, right? To be a poor person living in the streets, you were rounded up, you'd be sent to a workhouse, which was like a prison. And basically it's the criminalization, sweeping homelessness and criminalization of poverty rather than a welfare system. Also, we talked about the Irish potato famine as a Malthusian legacy, right? Could somebody tell me why the potato famine of 1850 in Ireland is related to Malthus?
There was no, it was argued that providing relief would just encourage the Irish to have more children. Again.
Right. Like, you know, very much so that the famine and the starvation of Ireland was not a product of British colonial policy. And we talked a little bit about this in class, how precisely to feed the masses working in the factories, the UK or England turned Ireland into a potato plantation because potatoes are high in calorie, they store well. It was like the perfect basic food, the food staple for the Industrial Revolution. So Irish farmers, dispossessed of their lands, no longer growing multiple things for themselves, all of that land was dedicated to one crop, the potato, that was exported to England. And even during the potato famine, which cost the lives of 1 million people, Ireland was continuing to export potatoes to England. And England did the same thing with India right around the 1900s. And in both of those moments, in those famines, it was the lack of sexual control, the inferiority of the Irish, the inferiority of the Indians that led to their overpopulation. They would breed like rabbits, they were like animals, and that was why they were starving, not colonial policy. So fast forward, we talked about more modern day, not that those aren't modern day, let's say 1900s, 20th century legacies of Malthus. We already talked about the population bomb. That's the most important, folks. I'm literally going to ask you, how did the enclosures and debates over welfare in England shape Malthus's arguments? What similarities and differences exist between Paul Ehrlich's population bomb and Malthus's principle of population? Okay, so I can't emphasize enough that you want to review the population bomb in 1968, okay? And then, of course, I'm going to ask you to give your own insight and put your ideas to work and tell me whether or not you think overpopulation causes environmental degradation, or to what degree, and if not, what else contributes to environmental degradation. Some other things that we looked at in terms of legacies were the Green Revolution, really important. The Green Revolution, can somebody tell me what the Green Revolution is or was?
The expansion of agriculture using fertilizer and new seed and stuff during the 50s, 60s, greater increased crop yields, dwarf wheat in India.
I like all those keywords in there. Good. Does somebody else want to? That was an accurate set of keywords and definition, but anybody else want to put it in their words? The Green Revolution.
The Green Revolution is basically when we just decided to do like a major agricultural overhaul, and this is when we see the modification of organisms and seeds, and that way we can actually have bigger productions of food.
Yeah, the green, so if you remember that video we watched where they're saying, oh, the poverty and hunger of the third world is because of overpopulation. You remember that video? It literally showed a graphic representation of Malthus's argument to justify the Green Revolution, that the Green Revolution was a large-scale project of international development. It's part of the history of international development, whereby to alleviate famine and starvation in the third world, genetically modified seeds were produced and circulated to third world countries, Mexico and India being two of the examples we looked at. And the idea was that if you wanted to alleviate famine, you needed to produce more food, right? And that's the link to Malthus, the idea that famine is a product of not having enough food, that the world, that there's too many people and not enough, so we have to grow more food. And that's exactly what the Green Revolution did. It increased global production levels of basic grains like wheat and rice. And it did that through basically the industrialization of agriculture in the third world. The US style of agriculture was exported to the third world through the Green Revolution, okay? And yes, the Green Revolution did increase food yields, but this also came with a set of problems. The environmental problems that are associated with using herbicides and pesticides. We talked about the commodification of the seed, the idea that these farmers in India now had to buy seeds from Monsanto every year rather than using their own. They're called land races, non-genetically modified organisms. And so the Green Revolution is a really fascinating topic, and it's definitely a Malthusian legacy. Also, eugenics. Eugenics is seen as a Malthusian legacy. Why do people argue that eugenics reeks of Malthusian ideas?
Because Malthus would basically argue that it was in your genetics, like why you were poor, and it wasn't like a matter of circumstances. So he's just like, well, if we just breed out the poor, then we'll have a much more successful society.
Right. Yeah, it's so fascinating. We talk about the naturalization of inequality, literally rendering natural or biological inequality. And Malthus was doing it along class lines. And what happens today and in the world we live in today is that oftentimes third world people and places are blamed. So there's a racial dimension there too, that third world peoples and places are poor and so-called backward and not modern, not because of how they've been inserted into a global economic and political system, but because of their innate biological inferiority, right? Malthus is just like the one of many folks we have looked in this class that have used science to justify racism and classism and forms of social domination, right? All right, so let's move on. We got all of the Malthus stuff handled. What's another sort of big area or another large topic we want to review?
The trouble with wilderness.
Okay, what is the trouble with wilderness?
One thing that I kind of, one thing I kind of connected from your last, like when you were talking about, like, you know, like the Industrial Revolution and the creation of cities and how disgusting they were. I was thinking, I wonder if that was when people started to like kind of disconnect from the wilderness and were like, oh, I just want to go to the wilderness to escape from this, you know, environment that we created.
Yes, yes, okay, that's right. You're exactly on point. So first of all, we want to historicize the concept of nature. It is precisely the Industrial Revolution and capitalist expansion where we have the creation of idea of nature that is peopleless wilderness. Okay, so we started that lecture, The Trouble with Wilderness, saying, hey, people haven't always thought about nature as being the opposite of the city. What Cronin is saying, first of all, you know, in contemporary Western society, nature is defined as the opposite of the city, the opposite of society. So one of the troubles with wilderness is that it is a definition of nature that removes people from nature, removes society from nature, so that we have this binary, that nature exists where people do not. It hasn't always been like this. We talked about medieval times, how people thought nature was the handmaiden of God, right? That nature was spiritual, that a hurricane was punishing people for being bad. And then, of course, we talked about how even during feudalism and pre-capitalist time, people were embedded in nature. People worked the land. People were much more, there was a much more of it was a rural lifestyle. So this sharp divide between the rural and the urban, between nature and society, that didn't exist. So yes, that's exactly right. But part of the trouble with wilderness is that he says it hides the history that produced it. That defining nature as peopleless wilderness, that's a product of the Industrial Revolution, right? First and foremost, we have to understand that. Okay, so that's one of the troubles. The trouble with wilderness, and you have to be really specific that by wilderness, he is meaning peopleless nature. Cronin is critiquing how we talk about nature as existing in national parks and not in our cities. That nature isn't the tree out there outside my window. Nature is Glacier National Park, right? So what's the other trouble with wilderness, apart from creating a binary between nature and society? What about the violence of the national park system? Because that article, he's really talking about the creation of peopleless wilderness spaces in the United States. And he's talking about the violence that was used to create peopleless nature. Anybody?
Forcing the indigenous people out.
Right, and there's a lot of interesting material on this, but unfortunately, for those of us like myself who love national parks, the creation of the national park system unfolded hand in glove with the creation of reservations for Native Americans and the dispossession of Native Americans of their lands. So the example he talks about is the Blackfoot Indians in Glacier, who were violently and forcibly removed from their ancestral lands to create that national park. So the second problem with wilderness, this idea of defining nature as peopleless wilderness, is that it erases the violence of Native American land dispossession. And we don't have time, let's talk about it another time. This history unfolded in fascinating and interrelated ways in Africa and the colonization of Africa as well. And most importantly, he says that the trouble with wilderness is that it's actually bad for conservation. Why does he say that, thinking about national parks and national park creation as a conservation strategy, why is this bad ultimately?
Because it creates this discourse that nature is so far removed from our everyday lives. So it's like, oh, that's happening over there. It's not happening right here where we are, like walking and living, And I'm thinking of the example of the African animals on the sides of landfill garbage trucks.
Yeah, the waste management.
Yeah, because it's like instead of creating a way of, recycling and, just improving landfills, their way of giving back is by having that zoo in New Braunfels. So
Exactly. Yes, good. That was great. Anybody else want to add to that?
Creating nature as like this, the idea of like the pristine, just like encourages people to not think of ways of producing habit, like retaining a habitat or producing spaces that are productive for like natural and human occupation.
Great. Yeah, exactly. He says the trouble with wilderness is not only does it create this binary between people and society, which is what you're all getting at, not only does it erase the history of violence against Native Americans that created the national park system in the United States, but he says it's actually counterproductive. If you think about creating peopleless wildernesses, and he's using national parks as the example, where you have cordoned off areas where people are not allowed to live and not allowed to work. And he's saying, if you think that conservation takes place in wilderness areas, we're not thinking about how we can create more harmonious relationships with nature, how we can live sustainable lifestyles, how might we actually address, yeah, he's writing well into, the climate crisis that got Paul Ehrlich all excited. The 1960s, the environment starts to push back against industrialization, right? And what he's saying is that if we continue to think about conservation as taking place in wilderness areas, we are not rethinking how we can be more sustainable in our daily lives. And that was a great example with waste management. And folks, don't even get me talking about lawns. There's, this fascinating obsession with lawns, especially in American culture. It does not make any sense whatsoever for Americans to be growing lawns in every single home when we're wasting that water. You just think about even the lawn, how we could rethink the use of our space within cities to live more sustainable lifestyles. Okay, good. Let's move on. We need to talk about the Guatemala. You want to make sure that you've got the roles that the U.S. government played in the Guatemalan military coup. Okay, so you've got to have that history down, and I've got a slide in the Guatemala presentation that talks about all the ways that the United States was involved in overthrowing Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954. And I'm also probably going to ask you to reflect on how that history in Guatemala also informs our understanding of the Central American migration crisis today, right? So you might want to be thinking about how that history of democracy thwarted in Guatemala put Guatemala on the path that it is on today, which is really quite sad. And this also brings up another lawns are wasteful. Yeah, they are. This brings up another really important part of the exam, which is the drug wars and the war on drugs that we did sort of right after the midterm when we came back. Okay, so tell me a little bit about the story of how cocaine trafficking got rerouted from Colombia via the Caribbean to Colombia to Mexico. Why did that happen, and when did that happen?
Was it in the 90s when the US government kind of came in and started like cracking down really hard? And then basically like the commanders, or like the second in command and whatnot of those organizations, fled to like Central America and then began their thing there.
Yeah, that's a really good start. So we want to start in thinking about the early 1990s when Pablo Escobar was enemy number one, according to the DEA and the United States. And there was a $10 million bounty on Escobar's head in the early 1990s. That is called the Kingpin Strategy, right? Remember the Kingpin Strategy? The idea that if you killed the kingpin, the capo, or the kingpin of the cartel, that the whole cartel would crumble. And Pablo Escobar is killed, I think in 91 or 93, I can't remember right now. And rather than the Colombian cartels closing shop, they decided, and basically the DEA did shut down that corridor, the cocaine corridor from Colombia to the Caribbean islands, to Miami, Florida, and then up through the rest of North America. The Colombian cartels started to sell cocaine to their Mexican counterparts, and that happens in the mid-1990s, okay? And yes, there were Mexican cartels. They were selling marijuana, they were selling heroin, and but cocaine is really the most lucrative product in the illicit global drug trade in the 1990s. And so these Mexican cartels become really, really wealthy and powerful. And in 2000, there's an election in Mexico that is going to play a really big role in the story of the drug wars. What happens in 2000 in Mexican politics?
Is that one, is it PAN?
Yes, exactly. The PAN party is elected, and the PRI party is, after 71 years, voted out of office. And what's important about the PAN party coming to power in Mexico, and there were two PAN presidents, Vicente Fox, 2000 to 2006, and then Felipe Calderon, 2006 to 2012, is that they took on the drug traffickers. They started to implement US-led war on drugs policies, because the PRI had been more corrupt, more in bed with the cartels. They let them do their business as long as they cut the government a slice and things didn't get too violent or too noisy. But with the PAN, and they start going after the cartels in Mexico, that's when we have what I think it was Parker was talking about, the Hydra effect, or the splintering of cartels. So when the head leader of a cartel gets taken out, you have the second or third in command vying for power. And so that's when we see in Mexico the uptick of drug related murders and violence. And then we have a second balloon effect, right? The first balloon effect is when cocaine goes from the previous route to being shipped into Mexico. And then when the Mexican government starts cracking down on cocaine trafficking, the traffickers reroute once more to Central America. Okay, so it's in the northern part of Guatemala where I work and do research on this topic that we see drug trafficking organizations increase cocaine trafficking in the early 2000s in Central America. Okay, and that's, remember folks, that right at the same time that Guatemala is emerging from 36 years of civil war. What a horrible time for cocaine to come to town. All right, so the question that I have here asks sort of what events occurred in the 1990s and 2000s to redirect cocaine trafficking from Colombia to Mexico and then to Central America. Okay, so that's the narrative that I want you to tell. And then also, what is sort of the policy alternative to the war on drugs proposed by the Global Commission on Drug Policy? Remember when we read that report, the Global Commission on Drug Policy? If they're not arguing for the war on drugs and military-based approaches to stopping supply, what does the Global Commission on Drug Policy argue is the opposite? What is the alternative?
Decriminalization.
Yes, decriminalization, and what else?
Drug treatment, like for addicts, treating it as a medical issue. And in cases like there's sort of like ambivalent but leaning towards maybe like the legalization and regulation of marijuana and softer drugs, and focusing on incentives at the root level, like coca production, of shifting people out of things, not eradication, but like instead like developing markets, and development is like a
Yeah, I
strategy.
don't know about that. I know what you're talking about. And part of that was Plan Colombia, where they were trying to get the cocoa farmers to grow asparagus instead or something like that. That part is not Global Commission on Drug Policy. But you're right about the first part. Their argument is that we need to treat the drug issue as a public health care issue, not a criminal justice issue. So yes, most certainly they are advocating for a treatment-based approach that reduces demand rather than trying to stop supply in a cat and mouse game of bullets and Black Hawk helicopters looking for drug traffickers in the Central American jungles. They're saying we need to cut demand through rehabilitation and yes, education. So they're advocating for a public health based approach. And the other key word you want to bring in here is harm reduction strategies. The way that they do this, they advocate for this, is yes, through funding treatment, right? Because part of the discourse of drugs is that when drugs are thought about through a criminal justice lens rather than a public health lens, people who have drug addiction feel a stigma. That's why they say break the taboo. We have to change the narrative, because this impacts whether or not insurance companies pay for treatment, whether or not people are embarrassed to seek treatment if they need it because they feel that they're thinking about themselves as a horrible criminal rather than as a patient who's suffering from the disease of addiction. So yes, they are all about the public health-based approach. And they also argue, there's a list, I want you to go back to that slide, where I sort of have 4 or 5 bullet points of their proposed approach. And it does include decriminalization, right? Which is sort of, you would expect, decriminalization of all substances. And they mention that states should consider the legalization of marijuana. But they're, by and large, to hit that answer on the head, you need to talk about the public health, that they're arguing for a public health-based approach.
I'm thinking of the example that you had given during your lecture of how needles, you can go and safely give dirty needles to any pharmacy and in exchange for clean needles, which has proven to reduce, you know, HIV and different diseases.
Yeah, exactly. And we had some really impressive statistics that illustrate the HIV infection rate of intravenous drug users, that in countries where they practice harm reduction through clean needle exchanges, like clean needle exchanges, that you have 3 or 4% HIV infection rate among intravenous drug users. In places like Russia and Thailand that do not allow any harm reduction strategies, that figures 40 to 50% of intravenous drug users. So it's about minimizing the public harm done by drug addiction, right? So that's, you've got that. The other thing is like what's called analogs. Methadone is an example where, you know, drug users, heroin addicts can get methadone prescribed from a doctor to help them wean off of heroin and also reduce the stealing, the prostitution, and the fentanyl overdoses that come with using heroin versus methadone. And so there's lots of examples there. So that's a really important point for you to review.
In the vernacular of drug treatment, that's referred to as medication-assisted treatment, or MAT, they call it.
Oh,
right?
okay, medication-assisted treatment. I also was watching a program on this, and I learned that there is an analog, another one that's, it might be for heroin, but maybe it's for crystal meth, or, you know, there's these substances where, these, what is it, medically assisted?
Treatment.
Medically assisted treatment, yes.
Yeah. So Suboxone is one of them for heroin, methadone.
Yeah, what was that word?
Suboxone.
Suboxone, yeah.
Suboxone.
Yeah, oh, and another example would be like giving out free Narcan to people. So yes, this is the idea here, that rather than locking people up, we use all of the tools at our disposal to treat drug addicts as patients, and that's going to be the best approach. We've
Another-
just got it. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say on the Mexico thing, something that people could use in their essays is the example of the Zetas, which were an anti-cartel like special ops unit that transformed into a cartel itself because the money is so much there.
Well, and it wasn't, you know, it's also related to the kingpin strategy and the Hydra effect. Basically, Calderon, you know, comes to office in 2006 and declares war on the narcos. That motivated the drug trafficking cartels to militarize their operations. And the Zetas were the army that was created by the Gulf cartels to engage in this frontal war with the state over territory and supply lines. So the Zetas were a product of Calderon's presidency in the sense that as he declared war on the narcos also militarized, and we have 200,000 plus civilians dead in Mexico alone. And what's really messed up is that the Zetas were recruited from the special forces in Guatemala that committed genocide in the 80s. The Kabyles are out of work. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, they start going into cocaine trafficking, and you will see the same techniques of torture used by the Zetas in Mexico that were used by the Kabyles against the Maya people in the 1980s. It's like full circle, right? So yeah, the Zetas are an example of the war on drugs and how it's been a disastrous failure. I hope, if anything, that you get from this course, sort of rethinking how we are failing miserably with the war on drugs. And like the Global Commission on Drug Policy says, you know, it's time to end the war. This is not a war that anyone can win. And we need to stop even using the term war and change the discourse, completely change the discourse, so that we think about drugs as a public health crisis rather than a criminal justice issue. Okay, so just another couple of things I want to mention before we sign off. I'm going to ask you to talk about the critique of the global refugee regime or the global refugee system. Okay, why does it not meet the challenges of today? When was it created? How did the history of the 1951 Refugee Convention reveal how it was created to meet the time and space of Europe after World War II, right? That's when it was created. Today, we have many more drivers of forced migration, right? And that's why Betts comes up with this term survival migrant. And you have to, in your answer, when you're talking about survival migrants, he says that survival migrants are people who are forced to leave their homes and cross international lines in pursuit of life and liberty and security, which normally refugees conventions protect people if you're fleeing from violence or fleeing from war, yes. But importantly, Betts says that survival migrants are also people who have to leave because their basic human rights are not being met in their country of origin. That basic human rights includes the right to subsistence, the right to clean water, the right to an education. So it really broadens the understanding of forced migration, that it's not just people fleeing war or fleeing al-Assad in Syria or fascist regimes in Europe. That today, poverty, deep and grinding poverty in countries like Guatemala, where the state is unwilling or unable to meet the most basic needs of its citizens, that is survival migration. They have to migrate to meet their own basic human rights, which includes subsistence and access to clean drinking water, okay? So you wanna be able to talk about survival migration. I'm just sort of looking at, I haven't decided on which questions, but I've got my list here. You definitely want to be able to talk about the impacts of the war on drugs in the United States, mass incarceration, and that history of the war on drugs in the United States. Any other questions? We're sort of out of time here, but we've really hit on some of the big ideas to get you prepared for the exam. No? Okay, so it's 1:50. I'm going to go ahead and sign out. You can email me, and I'm happy to talk with you or answer any questions that you might have. I'll go back to grading those papers and try to get those done as soon as possible. But any other questions, just write me via email, okay?
Thank you.
All
Thank
right,
you.
thanks to all of you. I wish you the best of luck, and just let me know how I can help, or if you'd like to talk with me a little bit more, I'm happy to chat some more. I hadn't originally planned to have office hours on Thursday, but maybe I will keep the office hours on Thursday for some last minute questions or additional review, okay? I'll send an email out to the group saying that I'm going to hold office hours on Thursday.
Awesome. Sounds good. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.